مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على
Muhammad, his life based on the earliest sources, by Martin Lings. Read by Sean Barrett. The book of Genesis tells us that Abraham was childless, without hope of children, and that one night God summoned him out of his tent and said to him, "Look now towards heaven, and count the stars if thou art able to number them." And as Abraham gazed up at the stars, he heard the voice say, "So shall thy seed be." His wife Sarah was then 76 years old and long past the age of childbearing, so she gave him her handmaid Hagar, an Egyptian, that he might take her as his second wife. But bitterness of feeling arose between the mistress and the handmaid, and Hagar fled from the anger of Sarah and cried out to God in her distress. And he sent to her an angel with the message, "I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude." The angel also said to her, "Behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction." Then Hagar returned to Abraham and Sarah, and told them what the angel had said. And when the birth took place, Abraham named his son Ishmael, which means, "God shall hear." When Abraham had reached his 100th year, and Sarah was 90 years old, God spoke again to Abraham, and promised him that Sarah also should bear him a son, who must be called Isaac. Sarah gave birth to Isaac, and it was she herself who suckled him. And when he was weaned, she told Abraham that Hagar and her son must no longer remain in their household. And Abraham was deeply grieved at this on account of his love for Ishmael. But again God spoke to him and told him to follow the counsel of Sarah and not to grieve. And he promised him that Ishmael should be blessed. Not one, but two great nations were to look back to Abraham as their father. Two great nations, two spiritual streams, two religions, two worlds for God. Two circles, therefore two centers. A place is never holy through the choice of man, but because it has been chosen by heaven. There were two holy centers within the orbit of Abraham. One of these was at hand, the other perhaps he did not yet know, and it was to the other that Hagar and Ishmael were guided, in a barren valley of Arabia, some 40 camel days south of Canaan. The valley was named Becca, some say on account of its narrowness. Hills surround it on all sides, except for 3 passes, one to the north, one to the south, and one opening towards the Red Sea, which is 50 miles to the west. The books do not tell us how Hagar and her son reached Becca. Perhaps some travellers took care of them, for the valley was on one of the great caravan routes, sometimes called the incense route, because perfumes and incense and such wares were brought that way from South Arabia to the Mediterranean. And no doubt Hagar was guided to leave the caravan once the place was reached. It was not long before both mother and son were overcome by thirst, to the point that Hagar feared Ishmael was dying. According to the traditions of their descendants, he cried out to God from where he lay in the sand, and his mother stood on a rock at the foot of a nearby eminence to see if any help was in sight. Seeing no one, she hastened to another point of vantage, but from there likewise not a soul was to be seen. Half distraught, she passed 7 times in all between the 2 points, until at the end of her 7th course, as she sat for rest on the further rock, the angel spoke to her. In the words of Genesis, "And God heard the voice of the lad, and the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, What aileth thee, Hagar? Fear not, for God hath heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise and lift up the lad and hold him in thy hand, for I will make him a great nation." And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. The water was a spring which God caused to well up from the sand at the touch of Ishmael's heel. And thereafter the valley soon became a halt for caravans by reason of the excellence and abundance of the water. And the well was named Zamzam. When Hagar and Ishmael reached their destination, Abraham had still 75 years to live, and he visited his son in the holy place to which Hagar had been guided. The Quran tells us that God showed him the exact site, near to the well of Zamzam, upon which he and Ishmael must build a sanctuary. And they were told how it must be built. Its name, Kaaba, cube, is in virtue of its shape, which is approximately cubic. Its 4 corners are towards the 4 points of the compass. But the most holy object in that holy place is a celestial stone, which, it is said, was brought by an angel to Abraham from the nearby hill Abu Qubais, where it had been preserved ever since it had reached the earth. According to the prophet, it descended from paradise whiter than milk, but the sins of the sons of Adam made it black. This black stone they built into the eastern corner of the Kaaba, and when the sanctuary was completed, God spoke again to Abraham and bade him institute the rite of the pilgrimage to Mecca, or Mecca as it later came to be called. Purify my house for those who go the rounds of it, and who stand beside it and bow and make prostration, and proclaim unto men the pilgrimage, that they may come unto thee on foot and on every lean camel out of every deep ravine. Hagar had told Abraham of her search for help, and he made it part of the rite of the pilgrimage that the pilgrims should pass 7 times between Safa and Marwa, for so the 2 eminences between which she had passed had come to be named. Rich gifts were continually brought to Mecca by the pilgrims who came to visit the holy house in increasing numbers from all parts of Arabia and beyond. The greater pilgrimage was made once a year, but the Kaaba could also be honored through a lesser pilgrimage at any time. And these rites continued to be performed with fervor and devotion according to the rules which Abraham and Ishmael had established. The descendants of Isaac also venerated the Kaaba as a temple that had been raised by Abraham. For them it counted as one of the outlying tabernacles of the Lord. But as the centuries passed, the purity of the worship of the one God came to be contaminated. The descendants of Ishmael became too numerous to live all in the valley of Mecca, and those who went to settle elsewhere took with them stones from the holy precinct and performed rites in honor of them. Later, through the influence of neighboring pagan tribes, idols came to be added to the stones, and finally pilgrims began to bring idols to Mecca. These were set up in the vicinity of the Kaaba, and it was then that the Jews ceased to visit the Temple of Abraham. The idolaters claimed that their idols were powers which acted as mediators between God and men. As a result, their approach to God became less and less direct, and the remoter he seemed, the dimmer became their sense of the reality of the world to come, until many of them ceased to believe in life after death. One of the most powerful Arab tribes of Abrahamic descent was Quraysh, and about 400 years after Christ, a man of Quraysh named Qusay was established as ruler over Mecca and guardian of the Kaaba. He thereupon brought those of Quraysh who were his nearest of kin and settled them in the valley beside the sanctuary. These and their posterity were known as Quraysh of the Hollow, whereas Qusay's more remote kinsmen settled in the ravines of the surrounding hills and in the countryside beyond, and were known as Quraysh of the outskirts. Qusay ruled over them all as king, with undisputed power, and they paid him a tax every year on their flocks, so that he might feed those of the pilgrims who were too poor to provide for themselves. Until then, the keepers of the sanctuary had lived round it in tents, but Qusay now told them to build themselves houses, having already built himself a spacious dwelling, which was known as the House of Assembly, Qusay it was who was the grandfather of Abdul Muttalib, himself the grandfather of the Prophet. Abdul Muttalib's hereditary function as host of pilgrims to the Kaaba was an intertribal one, and it was shared to a certain extent by all Quraysh. The pilgrims must be made to feel that Mecca was a home from home, and welcoming them meant welcoming what they worshipped, and never failing to show honor to the idols they brought with them. The justification and authority for accepting idols and believing in their efficacy was that of tradition. Their fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers had done so. Nonetheless, God was, for Abdul Muttalib, the great reality, and he was no doubt nearer to the religion of Abraham than most of his contemporaries of Quraysh and Khuzah and Hawazin and other Arab tribes. But there were, and always had been, a few who maintained the full purity of Abrahamic worship. They alone realized that, far from being traditional, idol worship was an innovation, a danger to be guarded against. These Hunafa, as they called themselves, the word means orthodox, would have nothing to do with idols, whose presence in Mecca they looked on as a profanation and a pollution. Their refusal to compromise and their frequent outspokenness relegated them to the fringe of Meccan society, where they were respected, tolerated, or ill-treated, partly according to their personalities and partly according to whether their clans were prepared to protect them or not. Abdul Muttalib knew 4 of the Hunafa, and one of the more respected of them, Waraka by name, was the son of his second cousin Naufal of the clan of Asad. Waraka had become a Christian, and there was a belief among Christians of those parts that the coming of a prophet was imminent. This belief may not have been widespread, but it was supported by 1 or 2 venerable dignitaries of Eastern churches and also by the astrologers and soothsayers. As to the Jews, for whom such a belief was easier, since for them the line of prophets ended only with the Messiah, they were almost unanimous in their expectancy of a prophet. Their rabbis and other wise men assured them that one was at hand. Many of the predicted signs of his coming had already been fulfilled, and he would, of course, be a Jew, for they were the chosen people. The Christians, Waraka amongst them, had their doubts about this. They saw no reason why he should not be an Arab. The Arabs stood in need of a prophet even more than the Jews, who at least still followed the religion of Abraham, inasmuch as they worshipped the one God and did not have idols. And who but a prophet would be capable of ridding the Arabs of their worship of false gods? In a wide circle round the Kaaba, at some distance from it, there were 360 idols. And in addition to these, almost every house in Mecca had its god, an idol, large or small, which was the center of the household. As his last act on leaving the premises, especially if it was for a journey, a man would go to the idol and stroke it in order to obtain blessings from it, and such was the first act on returning home. Nor was Mecca exceptional in this respect, for these practices prevailed throughout most of Arabia. Unlike most of his tribe, Waraka could read and had made a study of the scriptures and of theology. He was therefore capable of seeing that in one of Christ's promises, generally interpreted by Christians as referring to the miracle of Pentecost, there were nonetheless certain elements which did not fit that miracle and must be taken to refer to something else, something which had not yet been fulfilled. But the language was cryptic. What was the meaning of the words, "He shall not speak of himself, but whatsoever he shall hear, that shall he speak"? Waraka had a sister named Kutela, who was very close to him. He often spoke to her about these things, and his words had made so great an impression on her that thoughts of the expected prophet were often in her mind. Could it be that he was already in their midst? Abdul Muttalib had made up his mind to find a wife for his son, Abdullah. And after some consideration, the choice fell on Amina, the daughter of Wahab, a grandson of Zura, the brother of Qusay. Wahab had been chief of Zura, but had died some years previously, and Amina was now a ward of his brother Wuhayb, who had succeeded him as chief of the clan. Wuhayb himself also had a daughter of marriageable age, Hala by name, and when Abdul Muttalib had arranged that his son should marry Amina, he asked that Hala should be given in marriage to himself. Wuhayb agreed, and all preparations were made for the double wedding to take place at the same time. On the appointed day, Abdul Muttalib took his son by the hand, and they set off together for the dwellings of the Bani Zura, that is, the descendants of Zura. On the way they had to pass the dwellings of the Bani Asad, and it so happened that Qutayla, the sister of Waraka, was standing at the entrance to her house, perhaps deliberately in order to see what could be seen, for everyone in Mecca knew of the great wedding which was about to take place. Abdul Muttalib was now over 70 years old, but he was still remarkably young for his age in every respect, and the slow approach of the two bridegrooms, their natural grace enhanced by the solemnity of the occasion, was indeed an impressive sight. But as they drew near, Qutayla had eyes only for the younger man. Abdullah was, for beauty, the Joseph of his times. Even the oldest men and women of Quraysh could not remember having seen his equal. He was now in his 25th year, in the full flower of his youth. But Qutayla was struck above all, as she had been on other occasions, but never so much as now, by the radiance which lit his face, and which seemed to her to shine from beyond this world. Could it be that Abdullah was the expected prophet, or was he to be the father of the prophet? They had now just passed her, and, overcome by a sudden impulse, she said, "Oh, Abdullah!" His father let go of his hand, as if to tell him to speak to his cousin. Abdullah turned back to face her, and she asked him where he was going. "With my father," he said simply, not out of reticence, but because he felt sure that she must know that he was on his way to his wedding. "Take me here and now as thy wife," she said, "and thou shalt have as many camels as thou desire." "I am with my father," he replied. "I cannot act against his wishes, and I cannot leave him." The marriages took place according to plan, and the two couples stayed for some days in the house of Wuhayb. During that time, Abdullah went to fetch something from his own house, and again he met Qutayla, the sister of Waraka. Her eyes searched his face with such earnestness that he stopped beside her, expecting her to speak. When she remained silent, he asked her why she did not say to him what she had said the day before. She answered him, saying, "The light hath left thee that was with thee yesterday. Today thou canst not fulfill the need I had of thee." The year of the marriages was AD 569. The year following this was momentous for more than one reason. In that year, Abdullah went for trade to Palestine and Syria, and on his way home he lodged with his grandmother's family in the oasis of Yathrib, 11 camel days north of Mecca, and there he fell ill. The caravan went on without him to Mecca, and when it brought the news of his illness, Abdul Muttalib sent his son Harith to accompany his brother home as soon as he should be well enough to travel. But when Harith arrived at the house of his Yathrib cousins, they answered his greetings with commiserations, and he knew at once that his brother was dead. There was great grief in Mecca when Harith returned. Amina's one consolation was the unborn child of her dead husband, and her solace increased as the time of her delivery drew near. She was conscious of a light within her, and one day it shone forth from her so intensely that she could see the castles of Bostra in Syria. And she heard a voice say to her, "Thou carriest in thy womb the Lord of this people, and when he is born, say, I place him beneath the protection of the One, from the evil of every envier. Then name him Muhammad." Some weeks later the child was born. Amina was in the home of her uncle, and she sent word to Abdul Muttalib, asking him to come to see his grandson. He took the boy in his arms and carried him to the sanctuary and into the holy house, where he prayed a prayer of thanksgiving to God for this gift. Then he brought him once more to his mother, but on the way he showed him to his own household. He himself was shortly to have another son by Amina's cousin, Hala. At the moment his youngest son was the 3-year-old Abbas, who now met him at the door of his house. "This is thy brother. Kiss him," he said, holding out to him the newborn babe. And Abbas kissed him. It was the custom of all the great families of Arab towns to send their sons, soon after their birth, into the desert to be suckled and weaned and spend part of their childhood amongst one of the Bedouin tribes. Nor had Mecca any reason for being an exception, since epidemics were not infrequent and the rate of infant mortality was high. But it was not only the desert's fresh air that they wished their sons to imbibe. That was for their bodies, but the desert had also its bounty for souls. Quraysh had only recently taken to the sedentary life. Until Qusay had told them to build themselves houses round the sanctuary, they had been more or less nomadic. Fixed settlements were perhaps inevitable, but they were dangerous. Their ancestors' way of life had been the nobler one, the life of tent-dwellers, often on the move. Nobility and freedom were inseparable, and the nomad was free. In the desert, a man was conscious of being the lord of space, and in virtue of that lordship he escaped in a sense from the domination of time. By striking camp, he sloughed off his yesterdays, and tomorrow seemed less of a fatality, if its where as well as its when had yet to come. But the townsman was a prisoner, and to be fixed in one place, yesterday, today, tomorrow, was to be a target for time, the ruiner of all things. Towns were places of corruption. Sloth and slovenliness lurked in the shadow of their walls, ready to take the edge off a man's alertness and vigilance. Everything decayed there, even language, one of man's most precious possessions. Few of the Arabs could read, but beauty of speech was a virtue which all Arab parents desired for their children. A man's worth was largely assessed by his eloquence, and the crown of eloquence was poetry. To have a great poet in the family was indeed something to be proud of. And the best poets were nearly always from one or another of the desert tribes, for it was in the desert that the spoken language was nearest to poetry. So the bond with the desert had to be renewed in every generation. Fresh air for the breast, pure Arabic for the tongue, freedom for the soul. And many of the sons of Quraysh were kept as long as 8 years in the desert, so that it might make a lasting impression upon them, though a lesser number of years was enough for that. Some of the tribes had a high reputation for nursing and rearing children, and amongst these were the Bani Sa'd ibn Bakr, an outlying branch of Hawazin, whose territory lay to the southeast of Mecca. Amina was in favor of entrusting her son to the care of a woman of this tribe. They came periodically to Quraysh for nurslings, and some were expected shortly. On their arrival, Amina's choice fell upon one of their number, Halima, the daughter of Abu Du'aib, who was accompanied by her husband Harith and a recently born son of their own, whom she was nursing. In after years she told of the subsequent events. "With the child," she said, "we returned to our tents in the Bani Sa'd country, and I know of no place on God's earth more barren than that then was. But after we brought him to live with us, my flock would come home to me replete at every eventide and full of milk. We milked them and drank, when others had no drop of milk. And our neighbours would say to their shepherds, 'Out upon you, go graze your flocks where he grazeth his,' meaning my shepherd. Yet still their flocks came hungry home, yielding no milk, while mine came well fed, with milk in plenty. And we ceased not to enjoy this increase and this bounty from God, until the babe's 2 years had passed, and I weaned him. He was growing well," she continued, "and none of the other boys could match him for growth. By the time he was 2 years old, he was a well-made child, and we took him again to his mother, although we were eager that he should stay with us for the blessings he brought us. So I said to her, Leave my little son with me until he grows stronger, for I fear lest he be stricken with the plague of Mecca. And we importuned her until she gave him once more into our keeping, and we brought him again to our home.